approval of the meeting minutes. Can I get a motion on the minutes from May 2nd?
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the minutes? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. The next item is governance vice chair. We're tabling that till the next meeting. We'll move on to update on timeline. Scott?
This is going to be a little strange. We put in a couple of slides on timeline for those who were not at the first couple of building committee meetings. These come right out of the presentation from those meetings. So we haven't changed anything, but the reason we haven't changed anything is to demonstrate that we are not necessarily off of or out of sync with that originally scheduled timeline. We may end up adjusting by a month or so, depending on what happens over the next couple of months. But we just wanted to point out that it was always our intention to spend April and May working through the conceptual options and presenting some conceptual options and getting some feedback and talking about budget with a goal of, at the end of May, presenting kind of a summary of where we are, revising options, and perhaps making some recommendations tied to the appropriate budget. And we are, in fact, as we suggested 2 weeks ago, in the process of revising options for all 3 sites. We have gone back and had an opportunity to meet with school administration and the principals to discuss the space summaries and the detail of all of the spaces that we're proposing be in each of the buildings. And as a result of those discussions, we've made a number of adjustments, none of which compromised or took out any program or anything like that, but made a number of adjustments that will result in all of those projects being smaller. And we think strategy-wise, we have some good ideas on how all of those projects can be hugely successful and be significantly less than some of the preliminary budget numbers that we're looking at, kind of all new construction on all 3 sites. So our plan is to come forward at the next building committee meeting and present some of that information, and depending on the feedback and how it goes, we may be in line with exactly what this initial schedule suggested, which was then going out to the community and maybe doing a forum in June with the information from those concepts. So, and then at some point beginning to move into schematic design on each of the 3 school projects based on the approval of some concepts. And that would take place, that was always intended to kind of take place in July, August, September, with a goal of wrapping up schematic design, somewhere out there in the fall. So we're not necessarily off of that schedule, and we'll continue. And we're not. We've always said we're not going to tie to a specific date and say you must have a decision by June 29th, because it doesn't make any sense as long as we're still having a thoughtful discussion about what the right projects are and what the right budget will be. So, any questions related to that schedule? And as a reminder, if you're talking about another school project later tonight that we will not be here for, we did put into your handouts the schedule that shows kind of how that project would sync in with the rest of them, just as an FYI. And also, as a really big picture schedule, I think this particular slide comes out of the second building committee meeting we had. It was always the goal to kind of spend the spring and summer and moving into the fall developing the concepts and developing some schematic design, and that we wouldn't be in a position to move into detailed documentation on any of the projects until after we move through the fall and the town kind of committed to the project. So it's not, it's consistent with everything that's going on now, depending on, what happens in early June and the feedback we get at that point in time. Again, any questions related to that schedule?
I just want to mention, I'm Richard Marks, I know most of you, but Shane is out of town. He's meeting with the IRS tonight in Florida with his father, so that he'd rather be with the IRS than you. Not really. So, this period, even though we have treaded water a little bit for the last month or so, is really the most important period in terms of developing the direction for the project overall. So getting it right now, even if it does take an extra 2 to 4 weeks, as Scott said, really is going to shape the direction of the project from now forward. So getting it right in terms of size, getting it right in terms of what we renovate versus build new, and getting it to match, to align with the town's budget is critical, because if we don't get it right now, we'll always be fighting the tide, that we can't really get past. So I think that we are doing the right thing. I know that direction is moving toward where we need to be in terms of alignment with the budget.
And I know that there were several members of the building committee that wanted to spend tonight talking a little bit about the goals, priorities, some of the challenges facing the district that could be resolved by these projects. And so we don't want to in any way impede your discussion around that. What we've done is we've incorporated a number of the slides that we presented to the building committee at the first and second meetings, the first of which was an introduction meeting that some of you did not have the opportunity to attend. So for your benefit, we thought we would step back through that, but we can spend as little or as much time discussing those as you would like. But we're sort of establishing them as a backdrop to any discussion the building committee wants to have around that topic. As a reminder, we started off with educational planning groups from the Conniff, the Law, and the Hosmer, in addition to some more global visioning sessions with a goal of establishing and talking about strengths, challenges, opportunities, and goals of the district, introducing relevant 21st century design patterns and talking about those, and then also talking about building size and organizational strategies. And we incorporated that into our sessions that we had at the individual schools and our global sessions that included representation from all of the schools and the community. And as a result of that, we developed the educational programs, which in really nuts and bolts fashion comes down to a space summary that identifies all the necessary new spaces and existing spaces that need to be expanded as part of each of the school projects. You have in your handout the summary of the strengths that were identified. And we wanted to talk about those at all three of the schools with community, staff, administration, in an effort to make certain that we take most advantage with each of the proposed building projects of any existing strengths. And certainly we don't do anything to compromise those as part of what we're proposing at any of the three sites. So we would highlight some of those as, and you see it shows up here and here, just as an FYI to those that aren't familiar. There is an organized and important garden program at the schools, and it shows up later on, but this idea of indoor and outdoor academic space and the incorporation of that as a learning environment and the gardens as one piece of that learning environment came up repeatedly in those discussions. Incorporating some of the history of Watertown, because there is a significant history as part of developing design solutions for particularly for the interior environment at the schools. But there were a variety of different strengths identified. So we'll be keeping those in mind, because when we present presuming we present in 2 weeks, and we present the revised options, one thing we want to do, and it may take a couple of nights, but one thing we want to do is tie those options back to the goals, the priorities, and all those things that came out of the visioning sessions. So far, when we've presented options, it's only been informational data to show you, well, if you place the building here, if you place the building here, what are the advantages of this, what's the cost of that. But when we actually start to refine that to some options that we would recommend, and that would start to get in line with budget requirements, we want to make sure we're showing you also how those tie back to the priorities and goals that were established during the visioning sessions. Challenges, a lot of these are going to be obvious, but it's important to understand them. It's going to show up a lot of times with this idea of a lack of small group pull-out spaces within the 3 elementary schools. It occurs in all 3. Sometimes it's referred to, when people say flexible academic spaces, what do they mean? It can mean a lot of things, but one component of that is this idea of having smaller spaces adjacent to the academic classrooms where students can get tutorial work, pull-out work, do some independent instruction. And so the fact that it doesn't exist now, you'll see identified as a challenge. The fact that it needs to exist in the future, you'll see identified as a goal. And you're going to see overcrowded, based on the building size, you're going to see that consistently at all the elementary schools as a challenge, because we're adding more space to them. It's one of the key elements of this proposed program. Oh, one other thing I want to point out. This idea of a lack of space for student activity that is non-classroom activity. You're going to see, you see it in the space summary and in the program we're proposing. You also see it in the solutions when we get more refined on the specific options on each side, but how we're creating more kinds of spaces for student activity and student projects. And then some of the other challenges. And then all these tie together, because clearly anything that is a strength may lead to an opportunity, and anything that is a challenge may lead to an opportunity. But here you see that theme again of outdoor learning opportunities, creating small learning spaces in addition to the academic classrooms that also are quiet learning spaces, the indoor-outdoor connections, creating some collaboration space specifically for teachers and staff as professional work environment space. And all of these are things that we're addressing as we develop the proposed future programs for the schools. Community-centered buildings came up a number of times, meaning doing everything we can to make sure the buildings are more accessible to the community and have spaces that support extended day programs and support after-hours community use. So we would certainly want to address that in the proposed programs. John, I thought I saw your hand go up.
And you said exactly what I was going
Okay.
to bring up.
Good.
Fine.
Just telepathy. Just don't raise the hand, just send the signal. Okay. And I'm not gonna, I know some of you have seen these already, and we're providing this information as a handout, so we're not gonna go through each one. And I know we want to try to wrap up tonight early because we know you have the high school discussion and a hard stop at 8, so we make sure there's time for that. This is important because it's goals, and we've highlighted some that speak more specifically to the building and its development. So creating those open, flexible spaces, not necessarily open, but flexible spaces. The open means more like available to everybody at all times. Movement spaces, both indoor and outdoor, and this speaks to making sure they're adequate physical education space, and that there's this encouragement of students being able to easily move from their indoor academic spaces to potential outdoor academic spaces where that is plausible and possible. Safety and security at the entry. All of the, there's certainly agreement that whatever we do at all 3 proposed schools needs to do everything possible to create a safe and secure, still inviting, I would point out, but safe and secure entry. The welcoming as part of the inviting that I emphasize. Creating opportunities for display of student work that are in the right locations and provide easy opportunities without the need to have the work exposed. Proximity of space and thinking about kind of reorganizing space. Technology integration is kind of a given. We'll be layering that onto whatever we develop. More comfortable dining and cafeteria experience. In many cases, that means more space, but better space as well. So then there are second set. Any questions? I know I don't want it to seem like we're just breezing through those, but I also know that a lot of you have seen those in the past. But it was mentioned at the last meeting that we certainly need to in order to know if we've got a successful solution, when we get to a solution, we certainly need to know the goals that that's measured against. And it occurred to us that many of the building committee members did not have the opportunity to hear us go through those, so we're kind of providing a brief and rapid summary of them for that purpose tonight.
Scott, I want to recognize Dee Dee because she has, she wants to talk a little bit about goals as well.
Okay.
So,
Yeah, so I think that it would be, I mean, we've just heard kind of the results that came out of the visiting sessions. And we as a district have started to work through kind of an improvement strategy that frames our mission, core values, vision, and then we'll have a plan to make that happen. And I think it's good to hear a little bit about what the school district is doing and what kind of direction that we're thinking about for the future. And then I think Scott, just to go back and forth a little bit, the next part of Scott's presentation kind of talks about the goals of a school building committee, kind of those 4 key areas that we think about as a committee. And I think it would be great at the end of this conversation if we kind of settled on just a basic either theme or statement that encapsulates what we've done from visioning, kind of where the district is moving to, you know, what a school building committee really focuses on, and then what we as the Watertown School Building Committee kind of want to hold as just basic principles that kind of guide the discussions moving forward. So I will preface this by saying that this is a draft. So this is not something that is done. We're still working on it. The goal is to have this document finished by hopefully June. But I want to go into this conversation saying that this is not final, and it may change, but at least this is a good sense of where we're going. So as the former excellent teacher that I am, I will wait until everybody has a copy of the document. There's some extras that'll come back this way. So just as a little way of background, this document is the work of many, many, many people. It's, we have a strategy team that's been thinking about this. We have a marketing and communications team that's been thinking about this. The school committee has had an opportunity to weigh in. The district leadership team has discussed this, and soon we're actually going to have a larger meetings just to get some more feedback before we finalize. So this is not one person saying this is where we're going. This is a pretty collaborative effort. So you'll see here that, you know, we've fairly settled on a mission statement, which is that the Watertown Public Schools prepare students for life by engaging them in a challenging and meaningful education within an inclusive, diverse community invested in their futures. So that's pretty much what it is, their purpose. We're working through what we consider to be our core values. The core values that are growing in terms of coming up with a consensus are excellence through equity, collaborative and caring relationships, respect for the uniqueness of each individual in our community, and meaningful engagement, and collective responsibility for all students. And then last but not least, and I will say that this is actually the hardest part of the process, and we definitely are not there yet, but we're getting really close in terms of our vision, which would be something along the lines of the Watertown Public Schools inspires and empowers all students to shape the world around them. So I just think it's nice to have that out there in the ether in terms of what it is that we're thinking. And when I just heard this again, so thank you, Scott, for reviewing this, because I think in my growing sense of direction of the district, I see so many things that tie nicely in with the goals that were generated from the visioning sessions. And I think especially around, you know, meaningful engagement and respect for the uniqueness of each individual in our community really strike me in terms of what a building can do for that. But I think all of these collaborative and caring relationships, you know, we talk about spaces where students can collaborate. You know, collective responsibility for all students, having that ease of access and openness where, you know, we do share when it comes down to it, students and performance amongst the building, not just with one teacher. So I think it's nice to see the connection between that and certainly give you guys a sense of direction for where we're going. Anybody have any questions around what the district is thinking about for the future? I'm not going to digress and ask for feedback, but later, if you want to give me some feedback, that would be perfectly appropriate.
We're looking for more adjectives.
Yeah, more adjectives, please. So, I don't know, Scott, if you want to keep going, and then we can get to the point where we talk a little bit more about
Sure.
just where we want to go as a group.
Sure, you said something that just triggered in my mind, and we've had this conversation with Daedalus, but this committee hasn't necessarily had this conversation, and that is kind of the role of this building committee. And it's important to understand that every building committee is slightly different, but in general, the building committee is in charge of kind of making this project happen. You're not responsible for developing the educational program. Because you're not necessarily expected to be an expert. There are some experts among you, but you're not all expected to be experts. You're specifically balanced with architectural knowledge, engineering knowledge, educational knowledge, so that you can collectively guide the project in the right direction. You know, financial knowledge about balancing out the town's budget and what the town can afford. And so there'll be pieces of this that come to you, like the educational priority goals, etc., that you simply, as a building committee, absorb, understand, okay, that's part of what we want to try to achieve in this building, so I'll keep my eyes open and pay attention and see if I feel like we are achieving those goals. And then there'll be financial parameters that come from the town side where you're all responsible for saying, okay, we have to keep that in mind as well. But sometimes there can be a little bit of confusion, and the building committee, and I don't think that's happening at all here, but it does happen in some unnamed towns. There is confusion that the building committee is a school committee or are expected to be educational experts, etc. You're intentionally set up with a lot of diversified experience so that you can take the input from all of these entities, school department, town finance, etc., and kind of balance this thing out and continue to move it forward. So I wasn't planning to say anything about that, so I didn't do a very eloquent job, but I think it's good to point out that that's kind of where you're all coming from.
Richard?
Well, I'll just second that. I think that the best building committees that we've dealt with, and we've had the opportunity to deal with many, is really, as Scott said, to provide guidance to us and to do that through, through really speaking up. So, don't let things just not be said that you think should be said with respect to what you're seeing, what you're hearing, and what you're feeling about the designs as they're developed and even the information we're presenting tonight. We want to hear back from the community. We don't want to design in a bubble. Those projects aren't the best projects. The best ones are ones which have a lot of community input, which really respect the particular nature of the community that you live in. And we don't, so we may live in nearby communities. We know our communities better probably than you do, but you know your community better than we do. So we really want to get that feedback and understanding from you as Watertown residents and parents and leaders, and hear from you about how we can make this a great project for Watertown, not just a great project standing by itself. So please, participate actively, however you wish to do that. And there's lots of ways. You can give feedback to the chair. You can, send notes through Dee Dee that we distribute to the committee. We can take feedback in many, many different forms if you don't feel like you want to just throw it out there. But we're more than anxious to have you just throw it out there and say what you think.
So that was the motivational and inspirational part of the meeting tonight.
Yeah.
One of the other things that we did during those visiting sessions is we talked to the attendees about what we refer to as 21st century design patterns. And we went through a lot of them in order to keep them from just being words in space. We showed examples in all instances. And so we're just showing a few examples so the building committee kind of understands what we were talking to them about. But for example, when we talk about a diversity of learning spaces and spaces to learn in outside the classroom, we showed attendees and started a conversation with them about the kinds of spaces that are sometimes created outside the classroom and got their input about whether it was going to be appropriate in the elementary schools of Watertown or was not, or to what degree, et cetera. So we had a great opportunity to have a conversation around that. And when we talked about classroom flexibility, again, we talked about spaces that were outside the classroom that were available for students and teachers that weren't necessarily part of the classroom and how we might incorporate that into the buildings. We talked about the entry sequence into the building, and not just from a security perspective, but from a greeting and gatekeeping perspective, and how do you make a building the kind of space that students enjoy approaching and going into, and that parents enjoy, and the community enjoys approaching and going into, and instills a sense of pride. So when we eventually roll out and roll into more detailed design, we'll be incorporating, and you'll see the physical manifestation of some of these things. That idea of indoor meets outdoor, I mean, this is a very literal example, but this idea that you can easily move from inside the building to outside the building. We were talking about earlier the display of student work. So we presented and talked about a lot of examples of ways to easily incorporate the exhibit of student work to make for a more dynamic educational environment. Technology and media is kind of a given. And then I said earlier, creating professional space for the teachers, workspace, even dining space that is separated and professional, where they have an opportunity to collaborate as a team, and all of the things that are incorporated into the programs for each of the three schools. That idea of the health and fitness space, and not just a gymnasium, but the other components of health and fitness that go into that space. And I think this is This is a slide we presented maybe 3 meetings ago that Dee Dee was referring to when we were talking about ultimately having to balance out school department needs, town-wide needs, neighborhood and community needs, and budget. So we've just got that in there as a reminder. And then on the school department side, we want to make sure that all of the buildings include the necessary spaces. We want to create an educational environment that includes a lot of those 21st century design patterns and strategies. We've said many times we want these buildings to be efficient to maintain and operate. So we'll be constantly looking at how well we've done in that arena with regard to any proposed solutions. The building systems tie into a lot of different things, making sure we've got the appropriate building systems. So for those of you who hadn't seen this information, we sort of became concerned that there wasn't a set of kind of general and clear needs and goals, and just wanted to step back through some of this. On the community side, the gymnasiums obviously will be an obvious one. Making sure there's easy access to those in the way we organize the proposed floor plans at each of the sites. Making sure all the buildings ultimately serve as a neighborhood resource. And then budget is an obvious one.
So now I think if you could go back just a couple of slides. And I apologize, it's kind of interesting that I know that you presented this a couple of meetings ago, but it wasn't until I went back through everything and saw this again and said, aha. So this, I think, is getting, these slides, I think, get to the crux of it, meaning this is what I think we need to focus on. These 4 areas, the slide that, if you go to slide 4, that kind of just, it's a nice framework for, these are the things we're mostly concerned with, correct? Correct me if I'm wrong, are the school department needs, the town-wide needs, the neighborhood needs, and then the budget. I mean, I think that's summarizes pretty cleanly, what it is that we're responsible for, what it is that we should be always keeping in the forefront, and not losing sight of any of those pieces, especially as Scott just said, we represent various pieces of this, but we're all responsible kind of in the end for all of it when it comes down to it. So I think that, like, looking in, if you go to the next slide, looking in the school department needs, when we look through this list, I think that this is the perfect either starting place or simply a discussion around, does that list encompass everything that we think that we want to have as, priorities, or keeping, in terms of the framework of the conversation? Is there anything that we would want to add? Is there anything there that seems, it's important, but it isn't something that we want to always refer back to? I mean, to me, this is the perfect starting point for having that conversation. Was anybody struck by this one particular slide in the sense of anything?
I would just say, I think this is a great starting point, and I think it's good to see. I would just say that a lot of the goals are a little vague at this time, which they would be in this phase of the project. But I think what would be helpful for us is to define what specifically is an appropriate educational environment. And then Scott, when presenting, being able to speak specifically when we're looking at massing studies and floor plans to, this is our idea of what an appropriate educational environment is. When we talk about 21st century learning, which we've seen means a lot of different things, what specifically does that mean in this plan? And then I think what would be helpful too is if we prioritize what your desires and goals are, because ideally we could fit everything in, but things might not. And so it'd be good to know from your perspective too, Dee Dee, what is the most important for you, and then, kind of trickle down from that. So,
Scott, the slide that you kind of went through, I don't know if you showed the ones showed the rankings of those, just because I was at those visioning sessions, and those rankings came from, how many people were at?
45.
Like 45 people, like a huge mix of people. And so like the ones that say 100%, every single person in the room, teachers, town people, community members that don't have kids, parents, every single person in the room said that those were priorities for what they want in the educational space. And it's like all these 90%, it's like it was a huge diverse group of people thinking about what's important about education in Watertown, and that's where those numbers came from when we were ranking priorities for updated educational spaces. So I think kind of thinking about where those numbers came from is also kind of helps drive what our priorities, because that was a really big mix of people and what they thought was important.
Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah, that was one session that included, I think, about 75 people, and then the second session included over 50 people, and it was teachers, administrators, but we also had a lot of community members who were engaged in the discussion, so.
And I think also, sorry,
Let's go ahead.
Paul, I think to Kelly, your point, that if we were to look at like I'm struck by the goals, like the couple slides back, if you think about the highlighted things that were in the goals, and then you look at the priorities in terms of design elements, and then you go to that framework of, like you said, priorities, I think if we were to kind of connect those, because this is what Watertown said, and this is kind of the framework for the building committee, so define them, like you said, take from here in terms of 21st century learning environments. What are we talking about? Here we said, expanded building program spaces, future proofing, and get a little bit more granular, but not so granular that we're stuck. I mean, that's not that's the opposite. But certainly make it Watertown, as opposed to just kind of generic statements of everybody wants to go to 21st century learning environment. That's, I agree, what does that mean in Watertown?
Yeah, if I could just speak to learning environment, was the trigger for me. For those that don't know, I was the facilities manager here in '95 and for 10 years. This room itself is my signature back then. It was the special ed office. Dr. Early was special ed director. He said to me, I want to paint my office. Can you bring me a color palette? So I, being a good soldier, went to Coolidge Hardware, got the color palette, and I X'd off every color except antique linen. I handed it to him. I said, you can pick any color that's not X'd off. And that's what we did. And anything that was on the carpet was any blue that quick shipped. The tile floors were cottage tan, that yucky brown that we see everywhere. And then I kept hearing these voices as I went on in my career saying that that's not the way kids learn. You can't institutionalize them. Everything can't be the same. I used to tell the night custodians, when you're vacuuming up the classrooms, put those chairs and desks back in a row. The teachers keep grouping them together. Why are they doing that? And the voices kept saying, that's not the way kids learn. All kids learn different. The voices was my wife and my daughter, who's a teacher. And I slowly came around. I mean, there's a whole science on this. We're not asking for Taj Mahal-like things here. It's the way people learn, and the educators know this. As a non-educator, it took me a while to learn. Lori and I were at a workshop recently where we heard this great speech about movement and learning and how different kids learn. Some learn standing up, some learn laying down, some learn curled up in those little circles that you see, and they don't learn in rows anymore. So it's a new world, and we need to build to that. Stay in budget too.
Hello, yes.
Okay, just a quick comment. I just want to make sure that we don't repeat the problems of the past, because I went to every single meeting in the summer of 2016 with regard to schools. It took quite a battle to get those things filmed so that the public could know what was going on. And with regard to the visioning sessions, I know a cross-section of a lot of people in this town. These visioning sessions were not publicized well. Many people who've been very active around the school issues, who have kids and don't have kids, were not participating in this. And we need to be sure that we really include the entire community, or this is not going to go over. Less than 20% of our households have children in this community. This is going to be a big deal. I know that we have a budget now, but it's going to be even a bigger deal when it comes forward for the high school. And let's not lose sight of the issue of it's an entire community that we need to address. I heard a remark, I believe at the last meeting, that we shouldn't give people too much information because they don't know how to digest it and make sense of it. I find that insulting and rude to this community, because people are very committed to schools, they're very committed to doing well by students, but they want a practical nature and a comprehensive, balanced budget to do these things. So please hold on to that idea.
Anyone else? Comment? Question?
I'm just going to say this out loud. I don't know if it's feasible. but when we talked about like prioritizing our goals and kind of figuring out, and then you talked about how when we look at options, you're gonna tie the goals to the options so we can see, is there any way, or is it even important that we start tying dollars to each of these individual goals? Because we know that we're not gonna get everything that we want. Doesn't mean that we have to strike out everything, we just might have to have a little bit of everything or here and there. And I don't know, and again, I don't know if that's feasible and I don't know if that's important, but I just wanted to throw that out there.
Well, I think that what we plan on doing at the end of this month is to come, we've heard a lot about budget. We've clearly gotten a lot of input on all the goals and priorities and the kind of building we want. We've heard input with regard to, a desire on the town side to do a building that is green and sustainable and is consistent with the, some of the guidelines that the town has adopted. So we know that's out there. And I think that we plan on presenting some options that attempt to achieve all of those goals, as many of them as possible, certainly, and also get close to the budget parameters that we've heard described. And I think when we roll that out and start to have that discussion, we'll be able to see, okay, there's what we get, here's what we can get, and here's where the budget is going to be. And then we can start to have over time, a detailed discussion about how many other things do or do not fit within those budget parameters. But it's always going to come back to budget, which I think is your point. We want to make sure that we don't start a conversation about a whole lot of goals that we know would never fit into the budget. And we feel pretty, as we said this last time, we feel pretty good right now about the fact that we can do really fantastic projects on all three of these sites and stay close to the budget parameters that are going to be needed for the town. So we just need a chance to roll those, those revised options out there and talk about them.
I just have one thing, Mark. Scott, could you go to the school department goals? I do think that there's maybe should be a little more emphasis on one, which is getting the enrollment right. I know we talk about size of building, but the enrollment is not an easy thing to get right. We've been working on it with the school department. But I think there should be sort of in terms of a specific need, that may want to be added to the list, because a lot of cities and towns are struggling with it right now. It's not like 20 years ago when you could look at live births or something and predict school enrollments. Brookline's going through a nightmare right now of overcrowding. Other towns are going through shrinking enrollments, and Watertown's somewhere in between. So we need to try to figure out as best we can, and it is not easy, I will tell you, to get the right number of classrooms and potentially a strategy to add more classrooms later if we have to, so getting that right is, I think, should be one of our real key goals.
And one of the things we'll be talking about at the next meeting when we do roll out is for now, our discussions around enrollment have been to continue to keep those goals of 550 at the Lowell, 550 at the Hosmer, 345 at the Cuniff, and then the 200 pupil preschool, pre-K, early childhood learning center on the Hosmer site. We have discussed with the school administration and come to an agreement that in meeting those, in maintaining those goals, we need to be designing classrooms that don't necessarily have to be at the 18, 19 pupils per classroom, that they could float higher than that, slightly higher than that, because that helped us reduce some classroom counts while simultaneously having very reasonable classroom sizes and being able to accommodate that enrollment should you ever get to that enrollment. So I think we've made some good adjustments around that we'll be talking about at the next couple of meetings as we roll that out.
And just to what Scott is referring to, I think what we talked about is using the school department's guidelines when it comes to class size in K1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which progressively gets a little bit larger as they get older. So I think that's what we used as a basis for that conversation.
Okay.
still, the guidelines are important, though, to adhere to them.
The other goal that is not necessarily specifically stated here is one that we're seeing in many, many, many communities, and it does come from that, often from that community side, is the sustainability side or energy reduction side. And I know that there's been some recent push in town to look at that harder, and that's one where dollars really do become very important, because you want to look at not just a 5-year payback or 10-year, but start to look at 20 and 30-year paybacks at what energy improvements can be done. Obviously, now's the time to do it when we're looking at major renovations and or new construction. Gives us an opportunity to really be forward-looking, really be hopefully 22nd century buildings, because these are going to be here for hopefully 50 to 75 years, and they're going to continue to use energy for that time. So we will look at the gamut from basic code, which is kind of the minimalist approach, all the way to what's referred to as zero net energy buildings, and look at that on a cost basis to understand what the 30-year payback is, let's say, for a zero net energy building, projecting energy costs over a period of time. Yeah, so,
If I could just add one thing to that, you know, when you talk about a building that's going to be here for 50 or 75 years, and, you know, the energy efficiency associated with it, I think that's very important, particularly talking about the, you know, the life cycle cost of some of those components. But a lot of those energy components aren't going to be there 50 or 75 years.
Correct.
We renovated the library and put a bunch of energy efficient components in it, and we've swapped a bunch of them out
Absolutely.
since then. So I think it's important when we talk about that we talk about the energy components that are particularly the longer term ones that, you know, have that more staying power, more important, and aren't going to be swapped out in 5 years.
correct.
Or 3 years. So
It's tough. It's a very fast evolving industry. You know, we have clients that are looking at all electric buildings, because electric is thought to be in 8 years. You know, there's this curve where electric, because of solar and other energy sources, is going to become less expensive. But frankly, right now, it's darn expensive, you know? And so how do you account for that? And do you believe those 8-year, 9-year predictions, you know, along the curves? So we're going to have to take a very hard look at it, get a lot of input from a lot of people. You know, I'm seeing some nods of heads in terms of, you know, the things that I'm mentioning, and it is real. You know, these markets are changing rapidly, but we obviously don't want to do something that's foolish today that, as you say, 5 years from now, there'll be people will say, what the heck were they thinking? So it's going to take a lot of work, but I think we can get there.
And I think that's just something that we had talked about last week that's missing from some of the budgets that we've talked about today.
Absolutely.
So, you know, moving forward in those budget numbers, we need to be pulling those numbers. If we're going to go for LEED, how much is that going to cost? If we're going for net zero, is it feasible? How much is that going to cost? Just so we can start seeing the reality of what it's going to cost.
And we certainly can do that. You know, we have the fortunate circumstance whereby we can look at a 30-year payback or a 25-year payback. It's much different from what a private developer looks at when they're building a building that they know they're going to sell in 10 years. So it's a great opportunity, but it also presents the challenge of really trying to look at what things are going to be like 25 years from now, which is...
And we also need to leverage things like Mass Save. I'm not
Of course, yeah.
I've been told that Franklin High School just went online and they got $489,000 from Mass Save.
That's our, we worked on
That's true.
we worked on that project together.
Yeah.
AI3 and
So
Desmond. Yeah.
that's some serious
Yes.
money to
Some
come back
serious
to the
cash.
community.
So to supplement the budgetary discussion, you know, I remain concerned about the existing conditions evaluation and the importance of getting that as accurate as possible, and also the cost estimating and what the balance might be to the cost estimations that we receive. You know, are they single source? Do we have multiple sources of cost evaluation?
There'll be two sources, so just not to interrupt you, but two sources. So
Right.
the AI3 will have an independent cost estimator, and we do it as well in-house. And we have people that are at Daedalus who are separate from Shane and myself, project management, who specialize in cost estimating. So all those will be done parallel and reconciled and brought to you transparently.
And you feel like you have at your disposal the resources you need to evaluate the buildings
I know we
accurately?
do. I know we do.
and below,
Yes.
mechanical systems,
Yes.
roofs,
Absolutely.
foundation.
I feel we do have that.
Great.
Well said.
I just want to make sure that we have the resources available to us.
We do.
And the budgets we've seen to date, does that include the collaboration between the two of you? Or has that primarily been an AI3 budget?
No, it's
been-
included both.
Yeah, it's actually been a little bit more Daedalus at the moment, just because we've been, these things kind of go in a cycle, but we've been more involved because of being on the ground floor. And Scott and I were just talking, I think, 2 o'clock this afternoon, about some more strategies that AI3 is studying, and we're going to actually have both estimators, my group and the outside estimator, looking at that like tomorrow. In fact, we might even have the drawings on our email today. So yes, that process of being a little bit more parallel and simultaneous, which is important, so we're both looking at the same documents at the same time, is happening in real time.
And are you taking, sorry, I'm just trying to understand what the process
is
has been
exactly
so
what we
far.
want.
Yeah,
This is the
so
feedback
are
we
you
want.
taking benchmark data of other nearby towns when you're looking at those numbers that you're coming up with your estimates?
Absolutely, yeah. As you know, Lexington, Lincoln's embarking on a study of their building. Brookline has done lots of studies, it's built the devotion school. We bring all of that data into the
And build
picture.
work, right, so.
Yep, yes.
So are you sharing the cost data between the two estimation teams in real time, or are you waiting for certain milestones to reconcile?
So the way it's best done, and this is, again, it's been evolving because we've been really looking at a very conceptual level. But now that we're starting to get into more specific plans that we can do what we call takeoffs, which is measuring the quantities on the drawings, we'll each do them simultaneously and separately. And that'll happen over about a 2-week period. At the end of that 2-week period, then we get everybody together in the same room. And Scott and I end up being sort of the arbiters and say, and because the estimator may say, well, what were you thinking for, that area of roof that was replaced 10 years ago, we're going to replace that, even though it's only 10 years old, or something like that, that may not be obvious on a conceptual set. And we answer yes and no, we list all those assumptions, and then we bring that to the committee with both estimates. And the two estimates will be different. There's a science and an art to estimating. So the science is you measure the quantities, and you say, okay, there's going to be 32,654 square feet of brick exterior. The art is that worth, $32 or $35 a square foot, and that's the estimator's judgment. So there'll be two separate estimates brought together, but they should be at the end fairly close to one another. And when they're not close to one another, we'll explain to you why. And we also are transparent about all the contingencies, all the markups, all the extra items that are added, the inflation factors that are added. So you essentially participate with us, and we say, we think there needs to be a 5% inflation factor, and you may come back and say, well, I think it's 7, and we'll discuss that.
Well, that's really good because, the cost of materials changes almost daily.
It does,
Tariffs
it does.
and whatnot, but I think that what you've described is a great way of going about it.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that your framework for takeoffs is apples to apples,
Bingo.
if we say, and
Critical.
then you come together on where your discrepancies are.
Yep. And we've done that with AI3 multiple times and successfully, including Franklin High, which is a $100 million project.
So you feel like you have enough resources out there and professional builders can come in and do their own takeoffs and their own evaluation and come up pretty much on target with where you'll land at the end of these two coming together?
Yeah, so
I
when you
just
talk
don't want to
about,
get through this process and then get into, a bidding condition with the CM and his numbers come in considerably different than our two teams.
yeah, I can tell you that has not happened to us where there's a significant difference when, the CM does come on board. We anticipate the premiums that CMs bring with them. We think these projects do warrant a CM because of the simultaneous nature and the size and the market that's out there. I will say, it's a tough estimating market at the moment. We are seeing escalation in prices I haven't seen since like 93 or 94 or something like that. We've been doing this since 86. So it's an extreme escalation that's happening, as much as 8 and 10%, and it's a result of markets being so saturated that subcontractors aren't even bothering to bid. Whenever you get smaller number of bids, you get higher prices naturally. So it's a tough market, but we've done this before in tough markets, and we'll do our best to anticipate where it's going. Obviously, the curve is going to come back down. It's just a question, though, of when. But it could be 3 years from now before those prices drop again. They always do, but you don't know when. If you do know when, you're probably not sitting in this meeting.
The estimator that we use is a company called PMC, and they specialize in public school construction cost estimating. So their database is enormous. They have worked for us in situations just like Richard described, where Daedalus was the OPM, both entities doing their separate independent estimates and then waiting until they get complete before they begin to collaborate and make sure they're comparing apples to apples on scope. In this conceptual phase, as you can imagine, it is certainly more challenging to have a really definitive number because, for example, at the law site where we've got an existing building that we're renovating portions of, we don't have a set of construction documents. So that, just as Richard described, cost estimators don't know, are you pulling out plumbing, piping, and toilet 232? Are you leaving the piping in and just replacing the fixtures? They don't have enough documentation to know that. So that's why we have to sit down after we hand them the conceptual plans that show in general areas we're renovating, areas where we're adding to the building. We've sorted those renovations for now into sort of level 1, level 2, and level 3 renovations, with each one having increasingly more scope. But we've got to sit down and have a very detailed conversation about what is incorporated in those, because the drawings won't convey that information because they wouldn't be developed in enough detail at conceptual. So that becomes the art of trying to get an accurate estimate in this conceptual phase.
Yeah, no, I concur with what you said. I'm going to add one thing. I think it's also important as we get further along in this process, and we are into the documentation stages of it, that we maintain this parallel estimating, so that there is always a balance to the construction management estimate.
Correct. And as the CM comes on, there will actually be 3 estimates done. Still A grade, still Daedalus, and the CM. Even though it sounds like a lot,
No.
3 heads are better than 2, and 2 are better than 1. So that's why.
And that's what I was just gonna say, is at some point we need to talk about when the CM is gonna come on board. If we're doing a CM at risk,
Correct.
at what point we wanna bring them on board, because there's some definite benefits the earlier we bring them on, so.
And there's a misconception out there that shedding one of the legs to save money will, benefit us. It will not. The 3-legged stool is the way to go. I'm glad to hear Daedalus said it.
We totally believe.
We have more on goals or visioning. Did you want to add anything else?
No, I think, well, I say no, and then I'm gonna add something. I think what I would propose is that if the committee is amenable, maybe if I take a pass at looking at the goals from the visioning, looking at the priorities from the design elements, looking at this framework right here, and just kind of putting them together, and then maybe at the next meeting, like Kelly proposed, just doing some prioritization as a group, and then just moving forward. I think if I bring you a document that is a amalgamation of all of the different things that are out there, would give us a great place to start. I just wanted to have a chance to have everybody get a sense for where we're at, how we got to this place where we do have some goals that are out there, and the district is going in a direction. So let's see if we can pull that together in a statement, in essence, that talks about our priorities. So is that all right if I take a stab at that? It's good. Use more words. It's my favorite thing to do.
All day, every day.
That's right. And, just to mention, I don't want to skip ahead in the agenda, but, if we end up in a place where we have a decision around, a discussion around another visioning session, then it might behoove me also to wait until that takes place, just to incorporate some of the thoughts that might be from the larger community, so.
I'm just going to kind of try to weigh in conversations that I had with Scott and Richard. We're hoping that the next meeting, we have something we can talk about, and then we, at some point in the next, the way I've laid this out in June, the second meeting in June would be a very public meeting, which we could roll that out
Perfect.
and add to that. So it's kind of conceptual at this point of where we're gonna go. So I think they're working on trying to get us something, because right now we've been, this can go here, this can go there. They're gonna make a recommendation to this committee of what they came up with. And that's how I think we're gonna be able to begin really getting down deep into the weeds and asking the community again, what do you say? What do you think? So I think over the next 2 or 3 meetings, we're gonna meet 3 times in the next month. So hopefully, all of these things will start to come together. But I do think it's important that we went through this tonight, but I think it's also important that in the discussion that I had with Scott this morning, they have to give us something to talk about. Everything's been very conceptual. Now they're working towards giving us something that we can really put our hands on.
So then I get, based on what you just said, then I think I'll put together just a draft idea for the next meeting. And I think that'd be great.
And our perception of that community meeting is, and it may just be that the words mean something different to everybody, but when we think of the community meeting, we think of that as sort of a community input meeting where we present the proposed conceptual direction and get the community's feedback on that. We don't think of it as what we would call a visioning session, because that's completely different. A visioning session, you don't have any solutions on the table and you're just talking very globally. We feel like we're sort of beyond that, and it would be a community input session where the community gets to really look at something and offer their input and feedback on the direction.
Thank you. That's good.
And looking at the schedule, are we still targeting an August schematic design start?
Yes,
Okay.
assuming that when we at the next 2 meetings, let's say just hypothetically this committee meets on the 30th, and then we don't get through all the material, and so we were to meet a week later on the 6th, then I think that if there's agreement among the committee on kind of the conceptual direction we're going in, then certainly by the time we do some community input and have some more discussion, we would definitely be ready to proceed into schematic design by August, maybe even late July, August.
Yeah, so that's what I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, just to know that on August 1st, we'll say, we need to have a decision so that we can release the architects to start developing the drawings further, so that we can pick a design, go towards schematic design, which seems like a lot of time, but if we're meeting every 2 weeks, it's really only, 4 to 6 meetings.
I also want to caution that I don't want to, if we have considered considerable conversations, I don't want to put a hard and fast date.
That's exactly where I'm getting.
That's
So I
not
think
gonna-
that's when we have to start,
Yeah.
seeing where that schedule plays in, and if we're going to the community, obviously, we're gonna have feedback that's gonna revise the plans, and it's hard in a big group like this to come to a consensus, to release the architects to really start their work and move the process forward. So I think, I would just caution us that we need to just make sure we're keeping an eye on the schedule, because it's going to be easy for us to never get to a decision, essentially, so.
Can I just say real quick, I think that sort of brings us back to Tiki's point about having some goals and priorities, because when you have a community input sort of thing, I think it's important that the community knows that there are some goals that have been well developed and discussed with a lot of people ahead of time, so that way people don't
Not
kind
so
of think,
arbitrary.
yes, that's so arbitrary, people don't feel like we're starting over as
Yeah.
well.
And Scott, I mean, we have a construction start date of August 2019, and there's, working backwards on that, we are eventually going to have a drop dead date here if we really do want to start construction on this date. So I think that maybe, I know we don't want to set a hard date, but we need to have a goal in mind that we're keeping, like, sort of communicating with everyone so that we can just know what we're working towards.
Yeah, I mean, and I think Mark is suggesting it could go either way. If we present everything and this committee is comfortable in early June, we may be starting schematic design July 1 instead of August 1, so
Being very optimistic.
it could go either way, so.
Did you want to add, because we have a line item about lead, ZeroNet, and life cost cycle?
Yeah, I think I kind of jumped into that, Mark, a little bit, but It sounds like you guys are already pretty familiar with what these sort of buzzwords are about. There's some people that think sustainable is a little bit of an undershot, that's sustainable means staying at the current level, and we obviously want to get beyond the current level of these buildings, which is, of course, historic and not very energy efficient, and so we're going to really move toward something certainly beyond sustainability. This lists some of the benchmark standards, mass chips and LEED, that are ways that we can measure that. We can do that either just by looking at the scorecards or actually registering the buildings and achieving those goals. LEED silver is really, frankly, a fairly low target. I think, Scott, you would agree that we don't really have to do an awful lot to hit LEED silver. It's kind of a pat yourself on the back, but you're not doing a whole lot. So I think we'll want to really push the envelope a little bit. Obviously, budget is always a concern, so that's where we really look at life cycle cost. We look at paybacks. We look at this with a kind of a tough lens. So we're looking at it both from a public policy perspective, what's the right thing for the town to do, and we're looking at it from a strictly budget point of view, what it makes sense to do. And we're going to try to put those things together, much as we're putting together the educational goals with the town goals. We're going to put the sustainability goals and zero net energy goals together and say what makes sense from a budget perspective, what makes sense from a maintenance perspective, which is important because some of the most energy efficient systems are relatively difficult to maintain. And then, where do we want to take this? And we'll give you price levels, frankly. This is something that's relatively easy to put into monetary terms because there are clear additional capital costs that have to be invested, but those capital cost investments do have a payback, so that's where we'll really study how that works over a long period of time. And people may say, well, we got a $120 million budget, and if we spend 135, we are going to save energy in the future, but we can't do that, just as all of us make those same decisions about our own homes, our own cars, et cetera, et cetera. You only can go to a certain level with the money you have. But we'll give you, again, all these options so that it's a committee and a town and a community decision.
I would caution you saying that silver is a pat on the back, because just in experience, and I don't know if you agree with this, but silver has been, achieving gold has been incredibly hard, so a lot of people are ending up in silver.
Correct.
So I think that we
That's
just
what I
need to
mean.
make sure we word it correctly. Just because it's a pat on the back doesn't mean it's easy and affordable too.
No,
So,
I don't
yeah.
mean to be flippant about it.
Yeah.
My point was more so that here in Massachusetts, to explain it a little better, here in Massachusetts, our codes, especially with the stretch code, which is now really a part of our energy code, with water reduction that we just normally do in public buildings, et cetera, and with urban sites, we are able to achieve LEED silver generally without spending a lot of extra capital dollars. It's, as you say, when you get into LEED gold and above and other sorts of measures that we can look at, that you do have to spend significant capital expenditures up front in order to achieve those. And they usually do have a payback. The LEED standards, people complain about them, but they do make some sense. They're intended to force you to make investments in things that will have a long-term impact on the community and on the people that work in the building. So we'll, again, look at all of those levels and see what makes sense for the community.
So,
But-
just to respond also, part of the reason that these third-party credentialing organizations exist is that so you can measure benchmarks, right?
Exactly.
So, I would say to this community that we don't have to go LEED, just right off the bat. MSBA does require, but as he said, Massachusetts has a very aggressive energy policy, and these buildings will be sustainable. And so adhering to the LEED credentialing program may not fit with our other priorities, so I just wanted to lay that out there. But I will supplement what Kelly said and say that LEED V4 is at the silver level what LEED V3 was at the gold level.
That's right, that's exactly right.
So if we achieve a silver level renovations and new construction for these buildings, we're doing quite well.
Yeah.
I do also think that we do owe this exercise to the community, so that we can make choices. That's something that may make sense at a different level that we're considering. I think this is going to be beneficial for us, because I do, you know, there's our energy managers here as well, and the members of the Environment and Energy Efficiency Committee here. These are some of the concerns that they brought even to the town council last week. So I think that I'm appreciative of the explanations, but I do think we do have to do this exercise so that we can make choices.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's a good exercise. It's a healthy exercise.
And I want to piggyback on both. I mean, I think what's important is that we really look at the criteria for being LEED, not that it's LEED, but the criteria. And I think we do have to have the efficiencies, and we have to go through that, but it really is the criteria, not necessarily the name that we need to be for.
And what's the difference between LEED and Mass CHIPS?
So Mass CHIPS is really school-oriented, and it's really now called New England CHIPS, but it's essentially the same program. So it's collaborative for high-performance schools. So it, in a way, is a little bit more attuned to school construction. It's not as well known. You know, if you say LEED today, 90% of the people or 80% of the people in the community probably have heard of it. If you say CHIPS, 10% have. So in some respects, LEED is more interesting, I think, to members of the community, but CHIPS is actually, in a way, a little bit better program, I would say, in terms of school construction. But they really aren't tremendously different. We, right now, and I think in our office, it's literally half and half. Half are going LEED, half for CHIPS, as the gentleman alluded. MSBA essentially requires it because they give 2 bonus points to communities that achieve LEED Silver or Mass CHIPS. Well, I'm sorry, New England CHIPS 3, I forget what the standard is, but it's verified leader or something like that. But it's essentially the equivalent of LEED Silver. So without getting too deeply into the weeds, which I already am, you know, both standards are pretty good, and I think we could go either way.
Just to Leo's point, we have a client right now that's done multiple school projects over the last 10 years, all with the MSBA, and they recently decided to forego the additional funding from the MSBA and not even be LEED Silver, because they recognize that with the change from V3 to V4, the building they're designing is more efficient than any project they've ever done, and yet they would have to expend even more money to get that designation, and the cost analysis for them wasn't worth it. So I think that at the end of the day, everybody in this room wants this to be the most green, sustainable, potentially, you know, pieces be net zero building, but we'll have to balance that with all the other goals and priorities. And keep in mind, one of the things that we said last time, and one of the things we're doing right now, is taking a detailed look at some of these buildings and the investments that were made, you know, let's say in the last 15 to 17 years. And we're trying to avoid going into, for example, the lull where you've got, in our opinion, a relatively new addition in good shape physically, and just gut it out to the studs because we want to install all new HVAC systems, for example. We're trying to avoid that kind of approach. And so on buildings like that, or buildings where we're doing some addition and some renovation, we may make the addition, you know, as green and sustainable and energy efficient as possible, but we may make some budgetary and judgment decisions, you know, that make financial sense on not just gutting out existing systems that are perfectly fine. So it's easy on the new buildings to incorporate, you know, the new systems that we want. On some of the buildings where we're keeping portions of the existing building, we're going to have a discussion around how far we want to go on some of those. So,
anyone else on sustainability? Scott, did you have anything further? Oh, sorry, John.
Well, I guess I'm a little bit newer to this conversation and the language, so I guess I need a little bit more explanation as to kind of how what's up here on the screen, what we have here. I don't know what the V4 necessarily means, and how does that lead versus gold, or excuse me, silver versus gold, and how that relates to all these things on the side.
Sure.
We should, those are long questions that do require getting in the weeds on. I almost think maybe we should do that separately.
We'll get to those discussions.
It's called
yeah.
Google.
We can have those discussions, absolutely.
V4 is the newest version of LEAD. V3 is the older version
Just
of LEAD.
version
It's just the
4, that's
newest
all.
version
Okay,
of
every time
LEAD.
they bring out a new version, they step
Okay.
up their game considerably.
They do.
And there's a reason for that. There's a financial reason for that too. For LEAD continuing to make the requirements more stringent. It's beneficial to them as well. And so we always just caution clients about thinking they need the latest version, the highest level, because it's much more complex than that. So we'll certainly have those discussions.
Steve?
If we were done with the lead discussion, we kind of skipped over the enrollment that was in the presentation, and I think we might just spend a couple of minutes talking about that.
Sure. One of the things that we're doing right now as part of our analysis of the space that's needed in each of the buildings and making sure we've got all of the needed space, but making sure there's no fat built into them, is we're taking a look at every single space in the building. And I think we mentioned last time, but our goal was to take a look at spaces, for example, that were existing spaces in the building that maybe wouldn't change regardless of whether you said the building was capable of supporting 550 students or 500 students. And then also looking at classroom counts, not just based on enrollment, but based on the number of students that we're going to allow per classroom, and scaling those up slightly to I think right now in our analysis it's 21.6 students per classroom on average, still at a very, very low average, and making sure our classroom counts are based on that. But we don't want to get hung up on the enrollments, because we're not necessarily, I don't know how to say this simply, but we're not necessarily driving up the size of the building based on the enrollments, because this is not an MSBA project. So we're not plugging the enrollment into a formula and saying, okay, 550 students equals a 90,000 square foot building. What we're doing instead is saying, okay, we need X amount of classrooms, and the cafeteria is already sized at 3,200 square feet in the existing building. So we're going to leave it at that size, even though that might make it a little tight when you have 3 seatings for 550 pupils, et cetera. So we're taking more of a holistic approach than saying the enrollment is driving up the size of the building. And we can show you that in the space summaries when we show you the revised sizes of the buildings. But for now, we believe that we can make all of the reductions in sizes to the buildings and still be able to honestly tell you that they could support those numbers of 345, 550, and then the 750 at Hosmer in the 2 school environments there.
I think it's worth just touching again on how we got to that total number. And I know you said that before, but I think that's an important component of kind of giving a sense of, how conservative a number that is or not. But just to make sure everybody's still on the same page. And then I have one more other comment about that.
Yeah, right now, if you assume those numbers, it's at 13% above what the enrollment projections said. And keeping in mind it's a little bit of more of an art than a science necessarily when you're talking about enrollment projections. But we can go back and take a look at and remind everybody sort of where those numbers came from.
Okay, I think that, at least from my perspective, that we were taking over the 10-year projection, the highest number over those 10 years for each individual school, not and putting those cumulatively together. So, we're taking the most conservative approach in that sense, and then adding a significant percentage, 13% on top of that. So, So at least from my perspective, I think that's taking a pretty conservative approach and giving us a pretty good cushion in terms of those enrollment projections. And then the last thing I want to say about that is just putting in another plug for, we talk about crowded schools and we talk about student projections, and just want to reiterate again, maybe my own benefit, but that the current schools are crowded from a perspective of programmatic changes, not a explosion of student population. Our student population is pretty flat and continues to be projected to be pretty flat, and the new growth and developments, if anything, kept it from becoming a declining student population like some other jurisdictions, which would have a negative impact on our ability to get MSBA funding for high school. But, so, I just want to throw that out again to, make one more pitch for the growth and development that's happening in town isn't causing us a terrible situation with overcrowded schools that we're having trouble dealing with. Not the case.
And if I could just, yes. However, the thing I said the last meeting was, we also considered the fact that 18% of school-aged children don't attend Watertown Public Schools. So I think that when we had a conversation, it also encompassed the fact that we believe that more people are going to come back, which is harder to predict. We can look at enrollment projections and say that it's really not that dramatic based on the new building, et cetera. It's not. But there's a big unknown element because 18% is high. I mean, that's high for the state of Massachusetts. So I believe that we will capture back some private school students that it's hard to predict.
I agree with you, and I think that 13% contingency gives us,
more than
more than enough to deal with that.
Yeah,
I think in some of your experiences, some of the biggest drawback, or however you want to phrase it, was maybe 10%. So, having that 13% cushion should give us plenty to deal with in that regard.
It is conservative, but I think it's a good place to be.
Yep. Thank you.
That's perfect. It allows you 37 minutes.
In case there's anybody in the public that wants to speak, please.
Mark, Kate has a question. You.
Yes, yes.
Okay,
Just
so,
identify yourself, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Ariadna Hines. I'm a Watertown citizen and a member of Watertown Faces Climate Change, like Jolly Tager, who read a statement here a few weeks ago, and other members who have been coming to these meetings as well. I've been pleased to hear many of you express your concern and priority for the health and well-being of our children and their future planet. Last week, 2 of Watertown Faces Climate Change members presented this petition to the town council. And today, as we all revisit our core values for the renovation of the 3 elementary schools, I stand here representing the more than 500 citizens who voted this, who signed this petition, and the many more who did not get the chance. And in requesting that the Watertown School Building Committee design and build the 3 new school buildings to the highest efficiency standards available and include renewable energy production at all sites. Given the urgency of the climate crisis, we have demands that we believe are reasonable. First of all, we're thankful for AI3 being chosen because they know what they're doing. They designed the Plymouth North High School, which was certified LEED Gold in 2014 and described as a green marvel. Even though it cost $88 million, nearly 60% of the cost was reimbursed by the state, in part because of the many environmentally friendly features built into it, from the top of the roof to the subterranean water filtration systems. The project has been inspirational for the town of Plymouth, as you will realize if you read the cited articles. I actually made photocopies of this, and there's an article down here that you're welcome to look at. So we ask that on-site solar generation is added to all 3 schools. The possibility of using ground or air source heat pumps is actively explored. A conserving envelope is required to be part of all considered designs, and other appropriate healthy and environmentally friendly features such as rainwater collection, low flow toilets, a highly reflective roof, electric vehicle charging stations, low VOC paint are used as well. And I'm almost done. Energy costs are on the rise. Our schools are challenged to serve growing student populations and rising community expectations with constrained operating budgets and ever-increasing energy bills. Each year, taxpayers spend about 25% more than necessary in energy, more than is spent on textbooks and computers combined. Our renovated schools will stand for many decades, and we should think of future building standards rather than the current ones. Further, our schools have a high renewable energy potential. They're only 1 or 2 stories high, providing a big footprint for photovoltaic panels relative to the square footage inside. Most energy demand comes during the day when the sun generates electricity. We believe the savings in maintenance costs of the schools will quickly outweigh the additional construction costs for the mentioned environmentally friendly features. And this was also brought up several times tonight. I would also like to suggest that AI3 and the town work with Ed Lewis, the energy manager, who is an excellent resource to continue the great work that the town is already doing. And also when presenting future building options, AI3 include maintenance and energy costs as well, not only the construction costs. The climate crisis is a solvable problem, but everyone must get on board. Massachusetts communities, like several southern and western states, are leading the way towards 100% renewable energy. Cities and towns like Watertown are setting ambitious goals for reducing their energy usage and promoting clean energy. Making our elementary schools green would support many other town initiatives and provide fantastic curriculum opportunities. We want Watertown children to learn in an environment that is part of the solution. We believe in the power of inspiration. So I have all these petitions. This is a copy because the town council has the originals, but I don't know. I'll just give it to you. And if anybody wants to keep a copy of this, I can
Okay,
give
thank you.
this.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, if I may?
Yes. Sorry.
I'm sorry. All set?
Sorry, Jane.
Ed's jumping the gun for you, or next.
Ed, go ahead.
My name is Ed Lewis. I'm the town energy manager. I'm also a member of Watertown's Environment and Energy Efficiency Committee. And obviously, we have a huge interest in the great opportunity we have here with these 3 elementary schools, and actually the high school after that, too. But speaking here today, the Energy and Energy Efficiency Committee did provide to this committee back a couple of sessions ago a list of recommendations and thoughts on how we might be able to approach really making these schools very energy efficient, very, very great environments for the kids, and not with a huge cost premium. One of the things we did in that paper was to say that we would follow up with additional details, and just wanted to touch real quick on solar PPAs today. You know, we have a very small town. We don't have a lot of acres for solar area, but these are some really tasty roofs for solar. And really would love to see renewable generation on all 3 of these schools. This can be done inexpensively, and one methodology that we want to just make sure that everybody is up to speed on is called the Power Purchase Agreement. What that means, for those who aren't in the loop on that, is that a third party, a private company comes in, installs the array, maintains the array, and we purchase discounted energy from that. This is available to the town at a cost of 0, upfront cost of 0, and it starts generating money for the town as soon as we flip the switch. So that, and I understand as you were going through talking about the levels, and if we want this, it costs this. Here's a way to increase our renewable generation by a bunch, decrease our carbon footprint, and have renewable generation in all 3 schools. And it's not going to cost anything to start. Not going to cost anything at any point, and we'll save money. I really enjoyed some of your discussion on LEED V4, and we may have an offline discussion on V4 silver versus gold. Sure. But that's great to be thinking about it. We do need to make sure that we have a very rigorous commissioning program in place, and that's going to be think you and I will become fast friends on that. Basically, the commissioning, we just want to make sure that we're getting what we pay for. And I've been associated with 149A projects before, and that oftentimes is not actually the case. So I have great faith this committee is going to come up with some wonderful, wonderful schools, wonderful designs. We want to make sure we get what we're paying for, and that they really do meet the energy standards that we're setting. I do have copies of a little bit more details on the power purchase agreement, which I did want to hand out to folks. I also did include another copy of the original document that we sent to the committee, just in case you hadn't memorized it the first time.
Mark, are these things being attached to the minutes
It will
later on?
be, yes.
Thank you.
Yep. Kate?
Thank you.
Hi, Kate Coyne, Watertown resident and parent. Yeah, just I wanted to reiterate Mr. McGoon's discussion about the enrollment. I was at all the SMA wonderful summer meetings when we didn't have air conditioning. Because I believe we took the, like you said, the conservative from 2 studies, one from California, one from Massachusetts, and then we put a 13% on top of that. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's about 23% approximately. I think it was about 10%. Can't remember. But I just want to make sure that, was that right?
And I think we've increased the 10% to 13%. I don't think we
Well,
added.
no, and
additional-
then we're taking the original conservative estimates
Right.
and then buffering on top of that 13%.
Correct.
Okay, so I
Took the
think,
higher of the 2 studies and did 13% on top of that.
exactly. So I thought it was about a slow 10%, or was it 7?
I don't remember the difference.
I don't know, it was in between there, so that, I wanted everyone to understand that. And, okay, so that's a big buffer, yeah, okay. And, because the studies as, and I apologize for not knowing Richard's name.
Richard.
Oh, Richard. Yeah, the studies were interesting. And,
Kate, your point, we got to
my point, I'm
We have
sorry.
other things we have to do.
I had one other question,
Sure.
which was the 18, I didn't know that 18% of our school-aged children, is that school-aged children going into elementary, or are those school-aged children going into middle school or high school?
It's across the board.
Okay.
So, and we did break it down and looked at elementary, and it was about a 13%. It was, I'm just looking back from January when we looked at specifically. We were surprised that, I think there's a perception that everybody seems to leave at high school. It's actually,
Middle school.
but even through elementary. I mean, I think people choose from the beginning, like from the get-go before they even start in kindergarten. So we did look at the different grade levels. I'm trying to pull up the document that we had, but it's not, it's kind of spread out.
See that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I can send that to you, Kate, because we did look at that.
Thank you.
Could you
Back in
attach it to the
January.
minutes, Stevie? Because a lot of people have questions about that.
Yep.
Great.
Michelle?
I just had a small question about that. 18% you said is rather high for Massachusetts. I was just curious, do you know what the average is for Massachusetts in general?
I don't know what the average is, but I can find it actually pretty quickly, because it's state level data that goes over the school intent. It's called the School Attending Children Report. And if I had to guess, it's less than 10%, but
Oh,
you know,
wow.
we're in the top in terms of the amount of kids that go. So it's not, we would love to not have that be the case.
Yeah, I was just curious since you did make that point that we were above
Yep.
the usual for Massachusetts.
We can pull
Anyone
that
else on
together.
this portion
Yeah.
of the meeting? Okay, before you leave, I just want to, we're scheduling meetings for May 30th, June 6th, and June 20th. And we're moving to the town council chamber where we can get cable live. We're going to try a different venue and see if that will work, because it's a little crowded in here.
What's the 30th?
Mark, can you say those 3 dates again?
May 30th, June 6th, and June 20th. I wanted to try to put it out as far as we could in conversations with Scott. So I guess at this point, we're going to...
Yeah, we don't want to be awkward, but with respect to the high school, I do want to mention the MSBA is extremely process-oriented. You're going to learn that over the next few years. And so we do not want to participate in any discussions about the high school at this point in time because we are not engaged to work on it at this time. So
Thank you.
state that.
We'll let you, we'll get a 2-minute break.
It isn't that we don't want it.
Oh, the actual, the actual. These are copies of what we What I'm understanding is I can just that'll probably be best. On top of that,
they're gonna meet to continue to talk about the high school.
Series of criteria that go with these credits.
Yeah, because it really has nothing to do with elementary. No, but I think the idea that if you have absolute no school, we really have to actually have. School spring. Yeah, we are into very stable. So I think I remember the conversation was, no matter what. Okay.
Not really.
You added 13%. No, I said if that number the original
'Despite the humidity, I've been dealing with like dry eye contacts, so like
yeah, so it's
it's lower than that.
So compared to the lower,
So.
no, compared to let's say 5%. Right.
oh, yeah.
Paper bot, it's a paper bot.
That's
right.
okay, now I understand.
Is that.
I wanted to do and that's why I said.
It's all good, I'm not saying that it's not a good.
Okay, I'd like to call the meeting back to order.
We're only trying to do it now.
Yeah, but everything is being built. It's public, and again, it's publicly available on the department's website, so.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called the School of Children.
The next item on our agenda is the high school building committee. And I'll start first with Dee Dee.
Yes.
And I can add to it briefly afterwards.
Okay. So, this is not a lengthy conversation, I just, I'll make it as quick as possible. As we're all aware, we've been invited into the MSBA process for a core project, otherwise known as the high school. We are in the eligibility period, which is basically some basic compliance documents and putting together the building committee, doing our educational profile. I mean, there's like a checklist of things that we have to do to show that we're committed to being part of the process. So in the eligibility period on June the 1st, we will need to submit the list of people who are on the school building committee for the high school building project. So I just wanted to make sure before I put everybody's names on a piece of paper and your email addresses and your addresses that you know, everybody's pretty aware of the process moving forward. I just have a document that kind of goes over, most of us are familiar, but if you're not, it's good to know the MSBA process and the timeline. I mean, it's a great commitment to probably the next 4 to 5 years of our lives.
This is 2 pages, do you know?
Oh, look at that. Oh, 'cause my,
It's 2, just.
so
sorry.
I looked at this shit.
You have the full one.
Thank you, Richard.
I'm sorry.
Take one and pass that down.
Yes, there you go.
I didn't get collate or double-sided.
Just wasting all those trees, my God, talk about it.
We are pieces of paper in this committee, I must say. Print scouting.
I need some feeling for camping this episode.
You going?
The last one, I think we're good.
Give it to them, because I
So I think that, everyone's going now?
Yep.
Okay, good. Fabulous. We worked with it.
If you have an extra.
Oh, yeah.
Oops, sorry.
I know, I'm getting, remember I have to do this one at a time, so. You ready? Yes. So now that you have the document in front of you, this lovely 2-page document kind of highlights the next 4 to 5 years of our lives. But I think for me, the point was just, making sure that we're all on board with the fact that this is kind of a dual purpose building committee in the sense that we're working on a very large elementary project as well as a high school project, which, I'm sure we're not unique to having I know we're not unique to having a standing building committee that does more than one project, but I just, before I put people's names on paper, I just want to make sure that everybody had a good sense of the high school building project moving forward. Once we get through eligibility, hopefully we're going to try to move through that, they give you 270 days, we're hopefully going to do that a little bit more expedited. One of the things that we know from MSBA is based upon their assessment of our project. They've kind of put us on, there is no true fast track, but we were out of the gate first. They've given us a target in terms of when we can actually go to them for the project scope, which is in July of 2020, which is early, but we can't go before then. It's all in this little document right here. But it does indicate that there is an appetite from their side that if we are moving right along, that they'll meet us as much as they can because they know that the condition of our high school is in definite need of whatever we can do as soon as we can do it. So I think Mark was going to add a little bit more about structure and process.
I want to talk about, as we move forward, there's going to be a lull with the elementary schools with designs and things like that. So we may be using the Wednesdays just for high school. There's going to be times where we might have to add some time to the building committee meeting because of the fact that the high school is going to take some time, need some attention. We may add a separate meeting just for the high school because it may get up to a point. I'm not saying it's going to happen often, but I just want people to be aware that we may be doing some extra things. We're going to try to avoid it if we can, but there may be sometimes that it's not avoidable. So there is going to be a little bit more commitment in doing this, but I do think that it's prudent that it's the same committee because we're all looking at the same type of issues, so I think it's going to be very helpful as we go forward. And if you have questions, I'm going to try to answer them on that part of the process.
I just want to point out, Mark, that also it's, for people who don't know, it's quite possible that we have a completely different architect in OPM for the high school project because we don't pick that. And so that's also why additional nights or longer meetings might have to happen to the separate project. Right.
But Dee Dee and I had a conversation last evening. I guess if you could explain, the MSBA may look at, we already have a relationship, I don't.
Yeah, the selection of the designer, it goes through a panel through MSBA, and they have far more votes than we do. It's a very stacked deck when it comes down to it. But you can advocate for why you might have a certain inclination for an architect, but it doesn't guarantee anything, but at least there is some proven relationship, and I think that's obviously why it's important to separate these two at this point in time. It's just not, if you're aware, we just don't have as much say as potentially we might like to, and that's just part of the MSBA process. They're going to give us 48% hopefully of the project, and in return we follow their guidelines and their procedures, which sometimes are a little bit more restrictive than what we're going to experience with this one.
We get 3 votes, as I recall,
Yes.
right, Dee Dee?
Yes.
And the committee is 15 or 18?
I think it's 16.
So we pay for more, but we get fewer votes. What a deal.
It's just a
I know.
very strict process that the MSBA is following. We're fortunate doing this that we're not going to be following that. So we're a little more flexible.
Right.
So I don't know if anybody has questions at this point?
All good? Ready?
John?
Sign you up?
Actually, just a slight digression,
Good,
because
that's all in, good.
you pointed out that the architect and the OPM may not be the ones for the high school, but I don't know if we've ever said too, but they actually are not necessarily hired throughout the elementary process either.
Right.
Right,
Correct?
that is correct.
So I don't know if other people realize that
Yep.
they were only hired for a certain period, and then they can be renewed, or we can hire someone
Exactly.
different.
Yep.
It's up to this, we could make the decision to keep them if we want.
That's
Yes.
right.
We don't have to go out and do a formal bidding.
That's right.
We had
That's
it in
right.
the proposal.
So we would have to
the
take that
extension.
step.
We'd have to take that step.
Right.
Where does their current scope end?
Good
That's it.
question. This is news to me too.
It's at the end
Yeah,
of schematic
so-
design?
Yes.
Yeah, I
Yes, that's
requested, yeah, I
Feasibility
requested the
study.
RFPs.
One person at a time, hold on,
Sorry.
hold on. Dee Dee, you had first.
I was just gonna say, at the end of schematic design is where the scope of this project is through,
Right,
so,
right.
And that's dataless as well, or just?
yes,
Yes.
both of them.
Yes.
Yep.
But just so it was crafted, the RFP was originally crafted to give us the flexibility so that we didn't have to then bring on other firms, that at our discretion, we could continue the relationship.
Right, right.
Does it allow you to move forward with AI3 and Daedalus on certain projects but not others? For example, if one school was determined that it was a, more modest renovation or new construction, and another school was more complicated,
In general, because it's one project bid, so it's together.
Yeah.
Now,
We're trying to do this as cost-effective as possible by having them do all of this together. So I think that was the kind of the thinking in keeping them through this whole, or, whether we at schematic decide that we don't like them or for some reason, but we were trying to keep this as a package to try to somewhat minimize the cost a little bit.
Yep.
great.
And future, I'm sorry, you.
I was gonna say, the RFP was certainly written that way.
Yeah.
The RFP was written that way, as a package.
Is it possible to get a copy of the RFP?
Yep, it's on, I think it's still online, but we'll
I have
send
it, I was having a really hard time finding it online,
I think if you.
but I just emailed it, yeah.
Yeah, we can send it to them.
The only thing I could not get is the exhibit for Daedalus to really understand the roles and responsibilities. Because I was just trying to figure out like who's in charge of estimating, who's,
We'll try to get you all of those.
Yeah, that would be good.
So I think, it doesn't make a lot of sense, and I'm just throwing this out there to kind of start over after SDs. And I think it gives us some leverage with Daedalus and with AI3 so that they know that, or I guess at least AI3, that we could go elsewhere. But I guess my question is there a master budget that has soft costs for consultants as well? No? Yeah.
No,
Okay.
not at this point.
All right. Okay. Because there's a lot of soft costs that are going to be outside of anything
He
that.
touched on a couple of
Yeah.
them in one of our recent meetings, and we're gonna continue to make sure that those are part of the discussion.
Yeah. Because that's what I was trying to understand, because I'm an OPM, so I do exactly what Daedalus does, if anyone needs to know that. So I'm just trying to understand, like typically with the project budget, you're including all of your consultant costs, and you need to keep that bottom line. in
One of the
mind.
one slide in particular, and one of the things you gave out did do that.
Yeah.
If I could, Mark, that's how the $30 million construction cost for an elementary school became $40 million, once you add in all the soft costs, so.
Because that's the thing with SDs, SDs, you're going to start bringing in your consultants, you're going to start bringing in your MVP, your lead consultant, your commissioning agent, so those are a lot of costs we got to keep in mind too. And in the SD phase, we just want to make sure we keep the momentum if they're going to start, assembling their team.
So the origin of my last question about separating the school projects is because in the schedule, it seemed like they were all going to go at the same time, but they're different scales, different scopes. So I noticed they didn't comment on that, but some projects will likely take longer than others. So.
Yes.
Yep, and phasing is the other consideration. We have to figure out what's gonna be best in terms of keeping our educational program together.
Right.
Space.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it might also be beneficial to the CM to stagger projects and I mean, we all want to get it done super quickly, I agree. But, you know, when we study these different levels of scale, I think.
There's similar leverage that we can do with the CM too, depending on the size of the company, to compete them if we want to deliver some of these projects to a similar CM. And I don't want to get ahead of myself, but that is something that we'll have to talk about at some point.
If I could just, go back to provide some background. So, it's, when we first started this, it was anticipated it was going to be 3 separate projects, three architecture firms, 3 general contractors, and really the idea that if we're going to hire somebody to figure out what's the best educational outcome for the elementary schools in Watertown, it's like, well, why do that 3 times? There's going to be one best solution. Let's have one person, one firm sort of design that. And then we also talked about, having one contractor versus managing 3 separate general contractors, and the phasing, and having one general contractor responsible for everything gives us some economies of scale in terms of who's going to bid these big projects, and perhaps there'd be some cost savings from a scale standpoint, but also the coordination about moving things from site to site, swing space on this site to that site. It gives us a little bit more control having one single source of responsibility versus trying to manage 3 different contractors trying to do 3 different things. So I think.
Plus, we also have consistent products and buildings.
Right, so whatever mechanical systems, electrical systems, one contractor is going to be submitting the same product everywhere. Otherwise, you end up with 3 different air conditioning systems in 3 different buildings if there's 3 different contractors. So it gives us a little more control.
The caution is schedule though, that's a ton of manpower, especially if you're doing these projects simultaneously. And then if it's a fast track and we're talking about 2nd and 3rd shifts, like there's just not.
Quality of teams vary.
Yeah,
well, they're going to hire different
especially
subcontractors.
between
So
2nd and 3rd shift.
When you put CMs under pressure like that, sometimes you don't always get the A team on 3 simultaneous projects. And so we just want to factor that in too. I agree. I think packaging is a very, very smart idea. I'm glad we're doing it. But I just want to make sure that we're aware that the schedule and the scale and the scopes of these projects will likely vary, and the execution should be factored in. Not necessarily to prioritize one school over the other, but just
I do think that once we see what they come up with, will give us a chance to now figure out what the best approaches are going to be, and we're going to talk about all of these things. Everybody that goes to every one of these schools is going to want them done all at the same time, because they don't want to say, oh, the kids at the hospital are going to be 3 years ahead of us. But we have to evaluate what the best approach is going to be for us, because we're managing this project to a certain extent.
And at some point, talking about the 3 together, like Vinnie said, there should be some sole sourcing for some of the systems, your alarm systems and the maintenance systems, the keying, and that sometimes takes a vote of the town council. So I don't know what kind of time frame you need to do all that.
And if I could just answer Leo's first question, we have the flexibility. At the end of the schematic design phase, we're going to see what we have before we proceed to the construction drawing phase. The contract anticipates we can just extend them for both the OPM and the architect, or we could choose not to. If we're not happy with the outcome at the end of the schematic design, we could go out and re-solicit new bids for new OPM, new architect, either or both. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but under the contract, it's not necessarily, if we say we're going to do these 2 schools and the 3rd school, well, we're going to do something different. I think we have the ability to extend the contract for 2 schools, do scope work, and then go out for a bid for another architect just for the 3rd school, if that's what we want. I mean, ultimately,
I believe that flexibility is, I can check with legal and purchasing, but I think that's.
I believe that flexibility is in the contract, but really it's up to us about what's going to get us the best outcome. I mean, ultimately, us sitting around this table is going to make that determination. So.
At the end of this bid, though.
Well,
when we go out for the new one, then we can separate what we need.
If we need it, we can do, I guess, we have the flexibility to sort of do whatever we want, realizing that there may be a cost and time impact to that. But if for some reason, we always want to have the ability, if we're not happy with the outcome, the performance of this team, then we can just pull the plug on it and go hire somebody else. It may add another 2 years to the process, obviously, but that's the risk, so. You know, I'm a big believer in keeping a short leash on the team, making sure we're all working in the same direction, and you know, that's a much, you know, easier way to manage it.
Comparing the last two people we used for studies, this group is far and above gained most of the community's confidence. So, you know, unless we really see something that we don't like, it's gonna be hard to sell to the community that we're going in a different direction. Because they, clearly, you know, the others were here and they're.
Light years above what we have seen.
I think it's important to note, just in terms of your questions about sort of these three projects at the same time, this isn't the first time that AI3 has done a town with multiple renovations at the same time. And when they were talking to us about pitching that idea of doing all three at the same time and why it was so important to do, they gave us examples of that other work they've done in other towns with simultaneous renovation ability.
With the same contractor, because I'm not concerned that they're designing all three of them.
Oh, yeah, no, I'm just saying that, but they at least do have experience with setting up that work and the job, so.
Kelly, I would pitch, it's more like if we're, instead of doing 3 elementary schools for 40 million, you know, we're essentially, it's a high
It's a
school.
single project.
It's like a high school
Yeah.
project, you know, which campus style high school.
And
So it's
three
just-
locations.
It just happens, instead of all being on the same parcel, they're like separated by houses, so, but essentially,
Drive that crane across the street, it's fine.
but essentially, that's sort of
Yeah.
what we're looking for.
No, I mean, the overall size, if you're just looking at square footage, it's not that much. I think it's just, you know, the manpower spread across 3 sites, depending on their schedule. I mean, our construction schedule seems, you know, pretty reasonable, but if we're talking about expediting it, you know.
Okay. I think we're all set. Can I get a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second. All in favor? Aye. We'll see you on the 30th at the town council chamber.
Thank you, Mark.
That's why I say.
Yeah, they,